Soph. Well, thank you. I want to start by asking you to take a look at this picture. It's an image that was shared on Facebook a couple of years ago. It's an image that's caught my eye because I've got 5 children. I've often seen my kids do this sort of thing. I've snapped them, sent a picture to my husband in work, just to give you a flavour of that. This is my 1-year-old. I came to pick him up from a so-called messy play date with his childminder. But actually, when I started looking at this image, it wasn't what it seemed, because Mum had posted, I'd taken a snap to send to my husband, but then when I asked my little girl what she was doing, I was absolutely shocked and stunned, because what Mum found is that her little girl was actually practicing for a lockdown drill. She was practicing what to do if and when a shooter arrived in her school. And Mum made a plea to politicians, and she said, "Look at my daughter. She's barely 5, and yet she's standing on a toilet seat. I don't know what will be more difficult for her, standing there for a prolonged period of time, keeping quiet or keeping her balance." And she called out politicians, and she said, "This is your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come. How can you allow this to happen? Why are we not regulating the use of weapons in the US?" And of course, instead, what is happening, that we're teaching young people what to do to deal with the consequences, what to do when the inevitable happens, instead of what I guess as Europeans we think is really obvious, is to prevent the problem from occurring in the first place. And of course, by almost allowing this to become a new norm, we are complicit in creating that very future for young people like this little girl. Now, you're probably wondering, what has this got to do with the Future Generations Act that I want to talk about? Because specifically, this, of course, is an American problem. What's it got to do with my job in Wales and in the UK? Well, what are we saying to this young girl? Are we not saying that actually, instead of preventing climate change from occurring, instead of taking the decisions we would need to do that, instead what we're doing is preparing her and her generation for a future of mass displacement of people, of food shortages, of death and destruction due to increasing global temperatures? Current leaders have failed this young woman and her generation and your generation. Current leaders have, of course, lost their way. They're a prisoner in lots of ways by their old paradigms. And actually, there needs to be a massive shake-up. Perhaps at some point they were creative and they were brave, but they've run out of ideas. And we need your generation to be bringing the new ideas in. As Einstein said, we can't solve our problem with the same thinking that we used in creating the problems in the first place. And Generation Z are going to be absolutely crucial in solving the big challenges facing the world at the moment. Generation Z is the most diverse generation in all of history, and we need the diversity of your ideas to challenge the status quo. We need you to be bringing new ideas, not just to be doing the same things better, but actually to be doing better things. And I think that's got to start with a challenge to our economic model. An economic model which fails so many. Our obsession with GVA, GDP, economic growth at the cost of everything else. And of course, it was back in the 1992 presidential campaign that this famous phrase was coined. It's about the economy, stupid. But that's the economy that gives 50% of the world's wealth to 1% of the world's population. That's the economy that has some people living in feast and thousands and millions living in famine. That's the economy that is destroying our planet. So if you think it's all about the economy, then quite frankly, that's stupid. Let's remember, there are, of course, no jobs on a dead planet. But I want to give you hope. I want to give you hope from our beautiful nation of Wales. Perhaps Wales's most famous export is footballer Gareth Bale. You'll be hearing a lot more about Wales this time next week when Wales win the Rugby World Cup final. But I want one of our most famous exports to be the fact that Wales is the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through our internationally groundbreaking Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And when our legislation was passed in 2015, the United Nations came to Wales and they said, we hope what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. Action, more than words, is the hope for our future generations. So we're a small country of just 3 million people, but what we lack in size, we absolutely make up for in terms of the ambition for our future generations. So what does our legislation do? Well, it sets out a vision of the Wales that we want to see through these 7 interconnected wellbeing goals. Each of these goals has a definition. Now, I understand that's probably quite difficult for you to read, but let me just pull out our statutory definition of prosperity in Wales. An innovative, productive and low-carbon society which recognises the limits of the environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take the advantage of wealth secured through decent work. Now, that's not the catchiest of definitions, I accept, but let's just pull out these key words. Productive, innovative, low carbon, using resources efficiently, proportionately, acting on climate change, focusing on decent jobs, not just any old jobs. And when you place the duties on all of our statutory bodies in Wales, including our government, to deliver against that goal, we're moving to quite a different territory in Wales. The legislation also sets out 5 ways of working. It was defined when the legislation went through by the minister who passed it as the Common Sense Act, because all of these things are absolutely common sense. Planning for the long term, well, it's kind of obvious, but not very often done in public policy making and political decision making. There's a requirement, a legal requirement on our public bodies and our government to demonstrate how they're doing that. Preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse. Again, prevention is better than cure. Why don't we invest now to prevent problems from occurring in the first place? Integrating our thinking, realising that everything is connected to everything. So a decision that we might take over here might have an impact over there, and we need to be aware of that and address it. Collaborating with each other across our public sector and public policy making governance system, but also collaborating with the voluntary sector and the private sector. And then involvement, so involving people affected by decisions in the decision-making process. So as I said, nothing that you can argue with there, absolutely common sense. But what we've seen, you've only got to look at your Twitter sphere at the moment to see that common sense actually isn't that common. That's why we've had to legislate for it. So this requirement to plan for the long term, to think about future trends and scenarios that are going to affect our future generations, it's difficult to do that. Of course, we can't predict exactly what the future holds. A future of automation, artificial intelligence, mass urbanisation, and so on. But it's critically important that our decision makers are at least thinking and planning for these things and not just allowing the future to wash over us, to take its course, but actually shaping that future in the first place. Because we've never done that in the past. There are countless examples of the willful blindness of current leaders failing to take the right decisions to protect the interests of future generations. We knew long before anything was ever done about smoking, about the health hazards that smoking caused. We knew long before the financial crisis what was likely to happen there. We knew long before the Weinstein saga what was going on there, but we failed to take action. What are the things that are happening now where we're failing to take action for future generations? We have an obesity crisis. We're in a position now where, particularly the Western world, there are more people who are overweight than those who are starving. Artificial intelligence and automation, mass displacement of jobs, changes to other jobs. How is our education system, the skills that we equip young people with, going to provide them with the best possible chances for the future? And of course, climate change, the big existential threat which remains to be tackled. But our current leaders often say, but younger people and future generations, they talk a different language to us. They talk in emojis, and they're on Instagram. And, you know, my generation, I guess, and particularly the older lot, are still on Facebook. They're still posting their slightly dodgy and blurry images of their grandchildren, while you, of course, are curating perfect images on Instagram, TikTok, and so on. In fact, by 2050, there'll be more dead people on Facebook than people who are alive. So that's how times are changing. But that's where our current leaders are at the moment, you know, and that's if they're online at all. And I suppose there's just a little illustration here of where that is challenging. So this is a text exchange between me and my eldest son. He's 20. Now then, I've held a number of roles in the public sector in Wales. I've been called many things, not always polite on Twitter, I have to say, but G-Dog was a new one on me. I now understand that this means gangster dog. Now, so I don't know what I'm more offended by, being called a gangster or a dog. But you know what? Whatever he calls me, whatever they call you, our current leaders have a moral and, in Wales, legal responsibility not to be landing your generation and the next one and the next one in this. So we have an opportunity. The 190 countries represented across the world by you as One Young World delegates. We have an opportunity to demand that every country in the world provides legal rights for our future generations. We can and we should be demanding that, and we can and we should be starting that campaign with the backing of One Young World, with your support, with your energy and with your passion. We can demand that starting right now.